Two men walk along the hardened surface of a Roman road, the dust of a previous city still clinging to their sandals. It is viewed as a temporary setback, a brief moment of failure before the apostles move on to more fertile, welcoming ground. Human rhetoric eventually fails against an organized, violent mob. For the church to survive the growing conspiracy in Iconium, heaven had to intervene. The apostles had offered their bold witness. Now, God was about to offer his. The apostles' bold words were echoing through a city that was rapidly turning against them. But human courage has a limit. When a society is deeply entrenched in its opposition, rhetoric alone cannot break the concrete of a poisoned mind. Heaven had to provide a different kind of proof. Luke records the divine response in the second half of Acts 14:3. The Lord bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. In modern faith, we tend to view miracles almost exclusively through the lens of personal compassion. We see them simply as God alleviating human suffering. While Jesus and the apostles certainly cared deeply for the broken, the miracles in the book of Acts carry a much heavier, strategic weight. They are not merely random acts of kindness. They are divine endorsements in highly contested territory. Notice the specific language Luke uses. The Lord bore witness. This is courtroom terminology. Paul and Barnabas were effectively on trial in the court of public opinion. The religious leaders had presented their case. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong. It is simply incomplete. When you slow down and read the text carefully, a glaring contradiction emerges, systematically poisoning the minds of the Gentile population. The apostles had presented their defense, speaking with dangerous transparency about the grace of God. The jury of the city was completely split. So, God stepped into the witness stand. Imagine the scene in the crowded, dust-choked marketplace of Iconium. The tension between the two factions is palpable. Arguments are erupting. Then, suddenly, a person known to the entire city for their physical brokenness stands completely whole at the command of the apostles. The angry noise of the market abruptly stops. The whispers begin. When a withered limb is restored or a lifelong disease is instantly eradicated in the middle of a hostile crowd, it is not just a medical anomaly, it is a kingdom invasion. A miracle in this context is God explicitly stamping his royal seal of approval on the apostles' message. It proves that the crucified king they are preaching about possesses the physical authority over the present world, an authority that vastly outranks the local Roman magistrates and the silent stone gods whose temples overshadowed the city streets. Furthermore, Luke notes that these miracles were specifically given to testify to the word of his grace. The opposition was enforcing a system of control. Paul was preaching grace, the scandalous idea that God's favor is a free, unearned gift. The signs and wonders proved that this grace was not a weak, overly permissive philosophy. The book of Acts explicitly states that a violent campaign was immediately launched against the apostles. The city was poisoned against them. It was a dominant, restorative power that could rewrite physical reality. This is the third step in the Iconium blueprint. In the face of intense cultural friction, God does not abandon his messengers. He backs their bold obedience with undeniable evidence. Logically, we assume that an undeniable miracle would end the debate. If the opposition witnessed the laws of nature bending to the name of Jesus, surely they would drop their arguments and believe. We expect signs and wonders to dissolve the tension and bring unity. But the human heart is complex, and deeply held power is not surrendered easily. The miracles did not win everyone over. Instead, they forced the opposition into a corner. When critics can no longer argue with the evidence, they do not usually surrender. They resort to force. The divine signs did not bring peace to Iconium. They accelerated the political pressure. The divide in the city was about to mutate from a bitter theological debate into a violent, organized conspiracy. The atmosphere in Iconium shifted from a heated, public debate to a silent, lethal conspiracy. When undeniable evidence cannot be refuted, those in power rarely concede. Instead, they preserved their power by force. The signs and miracles performed by the apostles had pushed the city's division to its absolute limit. But the text does not say they fled in terror. Instead, Acts 14 records that they stayed there a long time. Speaking boldly, Luke records the terrifying tipping point in Acts 14:5. He writes, "An attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews, with their rulers, to mistreat them and to stone them." Look closely at the anatomy of this mob. In the ancient world, Jewish synagogue leaders and Gentile civic rulers rarely shared the same political interests. They operated in completely different social spheres. But nothing unites fractured enemies quite like a shared threat. The invisible line that had split the city in half was now weaponized. The whispers in the marketplace and the theological arguments in the synagogue had formalized into an official, unified execution plot. The method they chose was highly specific. They did not plan to arrest Paul and Barnabas and subject them to a formal Roman trial. They planned to stone them. To modern ears, stoning sounds primitive, but we often fail to grasp its physical and psychological horror. Stoning was not a clean, state-sanctioned execution like a Roman beheading or a crucifixion, which were carried out by professional soldiers. Stoning was a brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal act of communal violence. It required the heavy, jagged rocks that paved the city streets and formed the surrounding walls. It required citizens to physically pick up the earth beneath their feet and hurl it at another human being until their body was crushed. Psychologically, stoning was designed to be a collective action. Because the entire community participated, no single individual bore the sole guilt. The threat did not repel them. It anchored them. They did not run at the first sign of friction. They remained in the tension of the murder. It was society's way of violently purging a perceived infection. To stone a man was to literally erase his presence from the city, burying him under the rubble of their collective rejection. The stones of Iconium were waiting in the streets, ready to be turned into tools of erasure. Paul and Barnabas had stayed a long time while the danger was strictly verbal and economic. They had stood firm through the poison, the slander, and the intense social friction. They had exercised their dangerous boldness, their parrhesia, knowing it could cost them everything. But now, the threat had mutated. The mob was organized. The rulers were complicit. The stones were being gathered. Then, verse 6 introduces a massive pivot in the narrative. They learned of it. Before the plot could be executed, before the mob could corner them in the narrow stone streets, the apostles discovered the conspiracy. The narrative reaches its most critical juncture. What does a believer do when the friction turns fatal? If the blueprint of the early church is to stand boldly in the face of opposition, does that mean they must stand still and accept death? If they run away now, does it invalidate the boldness they just displayed? We often idolize martyrdom, assuming that the ultimate proof of faith is a willingness to die at the first opportunity. We assume that escaping danger is a compromise of conviction. Paul and Barnabas had a split second to make a decision, and they only left when an execution plot was finally set in motion and the mob was physically preparing to strike. The mob was forming. The stones were ready. They had to choose whether to stay and be crushed, or to flee into the harsh, unforgiving terrain outside the city gates. Their choice reveals a crucial, often misunderstood principle about biblical endurance. It draws a sharp line between faithful courage and reckless foolishness. The urgent whisper in the marketplace, the sudden realization that the political machinery had finally locked into place. Paul and Barnabas did not wait for the first rock to be thrown. They moved quickly through the narrow streets, slipping out the city gates and leaving behind the stones that were meant to crush them. Acts 14:6 states the outcome simply. They learned of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding country. They fled. To a modern reader accustomed to cinematic hero narratives, this might feel like an anticlimax. We expect the heroes to stand their ground, defy the mob, and either call down fire from heaven or embrace a glorious martyrdom. In our minds, Fleeing feels like cowardice. It feels like a concession of defeat, proof that the opposition had finally won the city. But the Iconium blueprint introduces a vital distinction for the Christian mission. There is a profound difference between faithful endurance and reckless foolishness. This changes how we must view the entire narrative. The question is not whether the apostles experienced hostility in Iconium. Jesus himself had given his disciples this exact instruction during his earthly ministry. He warned them of coming hostility in Matthew 10, commanding them, "When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next." The apostles did not run out of fear. They ran out of strategy. Their ultimate goal was not to die in Iconium. Their goal was to plant a lasting church in Iconium, and then carry the message to the rest of the known world. Biblical martyrdom is a calling to be accepted with courage, when there is no other faithful choice. But it is never something a believer should actively provoke or needlessly rush toward. Escape, in this context, is not a retreat. It is a strategic redeployment. The most stunning proof that this escape was not cowardice happens just a few verses later. The angry mob from Iconium refused to let the apostles go. They tracked Paul down in the neighboring city of Lystra. This time, the mob succeeded. They stoned Paul, dragged his crushed body outside the city limits, and left him for dead. But Paul miraculously survives, and his next move defies all human logic. After recovering and completing his work in the next town of Derbe, Acts 14:21 records that Paul and Barnabas turned around. They went back to Lystra, and then they walked right back through the gates of Iconium. The question is why the biblical writer presents this volatile, dangerous stop, not as a defeat, but as the ultimate blueprint for the early church. Paul returned to the exact city where the execution plot was born. He walked back into the shadow of the men who had just violently rejected him. Why? The text says he went back strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. The church in Iconium survived the mob because Paul had stayed in the friction long enough to lay an unshakable foundation. And he was able to return to strengthen them precisely because he knew exactly when to step away from the stones. He invested time in the danger, but he did not let the danger dictate the end of his mission. What does this mean for the modern believer facing a hostile culture? We often assume that standing firm for our faith means we must remain in a toxic, destructive, or abusive environment until it completely destroys us. We mistake stubbornness for faithfulness. But Iconium teaches us that biblical boldness is intelligent. It knows how to hold the line, but it also knows when to move. The stones of Iconium leave us with a deeply personal question. Step back and look at the complete architecture of this story. Iconium was never just a chaotic detour on the map of the early church. It was the master blueprint. Every element of the Christian mission is forged in this specific city. The deliberate entry into the social center of the culture. Most people assume that if God is in something, the path will be smooth. We expect open doors. We expect a receptive culture, the inevitable. Visible division that the gospel always provokes. The dangerous, unhindered boldness, the parrhesia required to stand when the culture turns toxic. The undeniable witness of God when human words reach their limit. And finally, the strategic wisdom to know the exact difference between reckless martyrdom and faithful redeployment. When we compress this ancient pattern into our own lives, a profound shift in perspective must occur. We spend so much of our energy praying for the complete removal of friction. We assume that if we are truly following God's calling in our workplaces, our families, or our faith, the path will be clear. The doors will swing open, and the approval of others will follow. When we face sudden resistance, when relationships fracture, or when the culture around us grows fiercely hostile, our first instinct is to assume we have failed. But Iconium changes the metric of success. The resistance you are facing is not necessarily evidence that you have made a mistake. Often, it is absolute proof that you are standing, exactly where the light is displacing the dark. This is the ultimate resolution of the Iconium blueprint. This is not a story about how to escape pressure. It is a story about what pressure builds. Think back to the opening image of this journey. Two men, covered in the dust of a previous rejection, walking through the high stone gates of a Roman city. They knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. They knew the whisper campaigns would start. We assume that intense pushback is a sign that we have taken a wrong turn, or that our efforts have failed. They knew the magistrates would turn against them. And they knew about the stones. The mob in Iconium had gathered the heavy, jagged rocks of the street with one specific goal. They intended to crush the apostles, to completely erase the message of Jesus, and to bury the infant church under a pile of rubble. They believed the stones would be nothing more than instruments of death. But the mob fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the kingdom they were fighting. Because Paul and Barnabas did not run away at the first sign of trouble, because they stood boldly in the friction for a long time, before strategically moving on, the new believers in Iconium watched their leaders model an unbreakable faith. They learned how to endure. When Paul returned through those same gates, months later, he did not find a defeated, scattered group of cowards. He found a resilient church. The stones that were meant to execute the apostles were ultimately reframed by history. The intense opposition did not crush the early believers. It compressed them into something solid. The very friction meant to destroy them became the foundational stones of a faith that would eventually outlast the entire Roman Empire. If you are standing in a season of intense opposition, do not mistake the hostility for defeat. Hold the line. Speak the truth. Trust the timing of your movement. The stones meant to crush you might be the very things God is using to build you. Behind them lies Antioch of Pisidia, a place that had just violently expelled them from its borders. But Iconium shatters that assumption. This is not ultimately a story about escaping danger. It is a story about standing in the friction. If this deeper look into the book of Acts has helped you understand the early church and your own season of resistance, consider subscribing to the channel. Share this study with someone who is currently facing opposition, and leave a comment below about what stood out to you. Keep standing firm. The events in this city establish a recurring pattern that will define the rest of the New Testament. Iconium proves that the message of Jesus inherently creates division, and that societal opposition is not a sign of failure. It is the exact environment where the church is meant to take root. The stones meant to crush these early believers would soon become the foundation of a faith that could outlast empires. But to understand how this mission pattern works, and why this specific city became the template for every journey that followed, we have to step inside the city limits. We have to look at the very first threshold Paul and Barnabas chose to cross. Iconium was not a quiet, overlooked village. It was a wealthy, agricultural powerhouse, situated at the crossroads of major trade routes. If you walked its streets in the first century, you would hear the hum of Greek commerce and feel the weight of the Roman Empire. Temples, dedicated to ancient gods, cast long shadows across the busy merchant stalls. The scent of raw wool and dry dust hung in the air. But when Paul and Barnabas walked through the gates, they bypassed the civic centers. They headed directly for a specific door. Ahead of them rise the imposing stone walls of Iconium, situated on a high plateau in Central Asia Minor. Acts 14 opens with a deliberate, calculated move. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. This is the first step in the apostolic blueprint. Throughout the book of Acts, whenever Paul enters a new city, he does not stand on a random street corner hoping for a crowd. He seeks out the local synagogue. He goes to the Jew first, and then to the Greek. But to understand the stakes of this decision, we have to strip away our modern definition of a religious building. Today, we think of a church or a synagogue primarily as a place for weekend worship. If someone speaks a controversial message inside a religious building today, it rarely disrupts the local government or the broader economy. The ancient world operated differently. In a heavily Romanized city like Iconium, the Jewish synagogue was not merely a place for prayer. It was the social, educational, and political nerve center for the Jewish population. It was the place where community elders gathered, where local disputes were settled, and where visiting rabbis were invited to read from the heavy leather scrolls of the Torah. The synagogue was a protected space. Rome tolerated Judaism because it was an ancient religion, granting the Jewish people specific legal exemptions. Before walking through the gates, they pause. They reach down and deliberately shake the dirt from their feet. It is an ancient gesture of finality. By walking into that specific room, Paul and Barnabas were stepping into a fragile, politically sensitive environment. They were not just sharing an inspiring thought. They were placing their message at the exact center of community life. They took their seats on the stone benches. They waited for the customary invitation to speak, and when they finally stood up, they spoke so effectively that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. The text notes that Greeks were present. These were God-fearing Gentiles, drawn to the morality of the God of Israel, allowed to listen from the edges of the room. In a single afternoon, the apostles reached both populations. The strategy was incredibly efficient. It was also highly dangerous. When you drop a disruptive message into the social nerve center of a city, you do not get a slow dock, gradual response. You get an immediate collision. By targeting the synagogue, the apostles ensured that their teaching would be heard by the most influential leaders in Iconium. They ensured the news would travel from the religious courts straight into the surrounding marketplace. They forced the entire city to make a decision, and a decision like that never leaves a community in peace. Preaching in the synagogue guaranteed that the message would spread rapidly, a physical severing of ties. But as they look toward the bustling center of this new Romanized city, they already know what is waiting for them inside. But it also guaranteed an immediate, volatile reaction. The response to the gospel was about to reveal the hidden fractures, lying just beneath the surface of the culture. And that reaction did not take long to completely tear the city apart. When the heavy wooden doors of the synagogue opened and the crowd spilled out into the stone streets of Iconium, the atmosphere of the city had already shifted. The message Paul preached was not a polite philosophical suggestion. It was a royal announcement. It declared that a crucified and resurrected Jewish rabbi was the true king of the world. A message like that demands a response. Luke, the writer of Acts, captures the immediate fallout in verse 2. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Notice the careful wording. They poisoned their minds. This was not a civil religious debate over ancient texts. This was a deliberate, toxic whisper campaign. The leaders who rejected the message weaponized the local Gentile population, turning ordinary citizens against these traveling preachers. When a mind is poisoned in an ancient Roman city, the consequences are immediate and physical. For the new believers in Iconium, aligning with the apostles suddenly meant risking their livelihoods. It meant losing customers at their trade stalls. It meant being cut off from the protective social fabric of the local community. More resistance, more anger, and stones lying in the streets, waiting to be weaponized. If you read through the book of Acts quickly, the division cuts straight through the local economy and the civic leadership. The invisible line was drawn. Families found themselves arguing across dinner tables. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion in the marketplace. The city was no longer just a quiet backdrop for a sermon. It was a contested battleground. By verse 4, the tension reaches a breaking point. The text simply states, the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. The population literally split down the middle. This is the second step in the Iconium blueprint. The true gospel inherently forces a division. In modern culture, we often assume that widespread approval is the ultimate proof of success. We believe that if a message is truly from God, it will naturally bring everyone together in peace. If a community becomes fractured, or if people become angry, we instinctively assume the leaders must have failed. We assume we should apologize, soften the message, or immediately leave to keep the peace. But Iconium reveals a different reality. The division in the city was not a sign that Paul's preaching was failing. It was absolute proof that the message was actively working. The gospel does not simply blend into an existing culture. It confronts it. When light enters a dark room, it does not negotiate with the shadows. It displaces them. Jesus himself warned his followers that his message would cause division, splitting households and communities, because it demands total allegiance. Iconium feels like a brief, chaotic blur. It is just another ancient name on a map. A minor stop on Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey. The split in Iconium was the visible evidence that the kingdom of God was advancing. Yet, the city was now a powder keg. The political temperature was rising daily. The opposition was actively organizing, pulling both civic leaders and the general public into a unified front against the apostles. Any reasonable strategist would look at this situation and declare the mission severely compromised. When the minds of the people are actively poisoned against you, the logical move is to pack your bags, slip out of the city under the cover of darkness, and find a more receptive audience. You do not stay where you are hated. But how did the apostles respond to this rising, dangerous tension? Their reaction contradicts everything we assume about safety and modern ministry. They did not retreat. They did not issue a public apology to calm the crowd. They did something entirely unexpected. When a city turns against you, the natural human instinct is flight. You gather your belongings. You slip out through the gates at night, and you survive. But Luke, the historian writing the book of Acts, connects the poisonous opposition to the apostles' response with a single, surprising transition. Depending on your translation, Acts 14:3 begins with the word so, or therefore, because the minds of the people were poisoned. Therefore, Paul and Barnabas spent a long time there. They did not stay in spite of the opposition. They stayed because of it. The familiar version of the story goes like this. The apostles arrive, preach a sermon, anger the locals. The new believers in Iconium were suddenly surrounded by a hostile, organized threat. If the apostles abandoned them immediately, the infant church would be crushed under the political pressure. The friction demanded their presence. But Luke does not just say they stayed. He describes exactly how they behaved while surrounded by their enemies. He writes that they were speaking boldly for the Lord. To understand what this actually looked like on the streets of Iconium, we have to look at the original language. The Greek word translated as speaking boldly is the verb paresiazomai, paresi-zomai. The basic meaning is to speak freely, openly, or with confidence. The English translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional, heavy political weight that the English word boldly often loses. When we hear boldly, we might picture someone speaking with a loud voice or an emotional lung, energetic tone. But in the ancient Greco-Roman world, this word was not about volume. It was about risk. Paresia originally described the right of a free citizen to speak their mind in the public assembly. Over time, it came to describe the specific kind of speech that risks the speaker's safety in order to tell the truth to those in power. It was unhindered, transparent, dangerous speech. It meant looking directly at a threat and are promptly chased out of town to avoid being murdered. For most readers, Iconium is a flyover city and refusing to censor the message to appease the crowd. This is the same concept used earlier in Acts, when Peter and John stood before the highest religious court in Jerusalem. The rulers were stunned by their paresia, their absolute refusal to be intimidated by the men who had the power to execute them. In Iconium, Paul and Barnabas were practicing this exact same defiance. They did not hide in the shadows. They did not whisper the gospel behind closed doors. They stood in the public squares and the marketplaces, fully aware of the poison spreading through the city. And they spoke with unhindered transparency. This completely redefines our understanding of biblical endurance. We often think of endurance as simply surviving a difficult season. But in the Iconium blueprint, endurance is active. It is the courageous, public declaration of truth, precisely when the culture demands silence. The apostles understood that the division in the city was the anvil on which the new believers' faith would be forged. The church in Iconium needed to see their leaders stand unflinching in the fire, so they would know how to stand when the leaders eventually left. The apostles held the line. They stayed for a long time, speaking with a dangerous boldness. But words alone could not hold back a city ready to riot. No matter how courageous a speaker is,